This is the panel that's titled What Could Go Wrong? We've foreseen having 3 speakers on the panel. Joe Glauber, who's a senior research fellow at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. John Baffis, who's senior economist at the World Bank. And so I'm going to invite you to come up to the stage. We have a third panelist who has not yet arrived. So normally Alan Matthews, who's a professor emeritus, would also be joining us on the stage, and we expect him to come, but maybe only in the middle of the panel. You are welcome to sit next to me. So we can move quickly to talk about what could go wrong.
That's my cue.
So thank you everyone who's in the room for your endurance. It's been a long day. I'm happy to have you both of you with me on the stage. We don't have a presentation foreseen for this, so this is a fireside chat. Just the 3 of us. And you both have a long career working on these topics in research and also liaising with policy. So I'm sure you have many insights. And maybe you can also, if you have some optimism or hope, you could point us to directions where you think that there's useful ways to be cooperating. So I'll pass the floor over to you first,
Okay.
Joe.
Great.
Thank you very much.
No, thanks. And I again, hearkening back to Tassos's presentation last year about the blissfully linear lines and baseline projections. Yeah, it's all about, as someone said to me, there's probability 0 any of this will come true. But the interest is how different things are, and with the baselines at least, trying to understand the trends and gaining the insights from what are the very good insights out of the baseline exercise. But I think, obviously the thing that strikes, that one would have to note at the outset is just the trade environment is just so different right now, and trying to figure out, what is going to, happen, not just over the next 10 years, but over the next 10 minutes almost. I mean, it's, you think about the last trade war, and, interesting, because one of the points I make and a lot of other people make is just the long-term costs of trade wars. The trade wars obviously have short-term costs that are very real, and, in the U.S. at least, we've been pouring billions of dollars into the sector to compensate farmers. The long-run costs, obviously, very important too. You've seen this huge shift. I think the numbers in 2016 were U.S. was roughly 45% or so of the China market, and Brazil was around 40% of the China market. By last year, it was 70% Brazil, 20% U.S., and yet the baselines at the time were already projecting that Brazil would take a larger and larger share, even before the trade war hit. But the amazing thing is just how rapidly, first of all, Brazil was able to ramp up to those higher market shares. I think the planted area over the last, since 2018, has increased like 30%. For soybeans. I mean, just an amazing thing. And even this year, I think the baseline last year was saying roughly 0.7 of a million hectare would, you'd see that sort of increase in Brazil, and now we're already saying 1.5. And if again, the last trade war was any indication, you'll see perhaps more than that. But I think that's just a small tip of it. The environment we face right now with all these new tariffs, I dare say I could go right now and ask people in the room, what's the U.S. tariff on this country or that country, and no one would have a clue. It is really changes because of let alone the court cases that are right now, or the case before the Supreme Court, but just all the disruption that has caused. And we're already seeing signs, because these tariffs are just now really taking place, we are starting to see the sort of trade diversion that you might expect for things. I mean, coffee is a great example where we have 50% tariffs on Brazil right now. We have what may be 100% tariffs going into Nicaragua. I mean, these are all coffee economies that are going to be highly disrupted. So all that is, I think, a big thing, probably less so for the particularly narrow, relatively more narrow baseline, because we tend to talk mainly about row crops and mainly about livestock, which are all very important and will have trade diversions and that sort of thing, but all the specialty crops as well are just in beverages and other sorts of things. And I think for that reason, it's you know, particularly with an MFN system, at least for the US now, totally thrown out. And unfortunately, if I look back at what one of the biggest disappointments I had of the previous administration is the fact that they didn't roll back anything, right? I mean, we didn't resolve an AB crisis or a pellet body crisis in Geneva. There was very little done. That's not entirely fair. There were discussions certainly, but it wasn't resolved. You didn't roll back any of the supplemental tariffs on China. They were put in abeyance, but they were still on the books. And so the question is, how do you put Humpty Dumpty back together again after all this round of tariffs? And maybe the Supreme Court in the US will do it, but I suspect, like most pundits are saying, that there will just be other authorities that the Trump administration will use to put in new tariffs to do that. That said, I think in regards to your optimism, I think generally you look at how the world has treated these past crises, the first trade war or COVID or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that the trading system has done remarkably well and has been very resilient and with certainly added costs, but not, wheat was available during the crisis in 22, 23, and so that's all the good news. And people still meet in Geneva to resolve SPS issues. There's still a lot of functioning things within the WTO that I think are really important and really, need to be maintained. But this is a very, I think, troubling moment, obviously, and I think that's, I have other things to say on climate, other things, but I'm going to pass.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, there you go.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks to the organizers of the forum for inviting me, and thanks, Joe, for starting the difficult question, the trade one. Okay, what could go wrong? I'm gonna focus on two aspects, areas or risks, so to speak. One is input costs for agriculture, and the second one is climate change. On the first one, I can claim some expertise. On the second one, I'll do my best. Let's start from the input costs. Two important aspects of the input costs are energy prices and fertilizer prices. We just published our commodity markets outlook last week, so we have a kind of narrative and story of what's going to take place in energy prices and almost commodity price for the next 2 to 3 years. So what the remarks I'm going to make pretty much reflect the findings of our report. Now, on the energy prices, I'll start with oil, and oil is important for the obvious reason that it's a fuel used extensively in agricultural production, but there's a less known reason as to why oil is important, because it's also used to price as a benchmark for LNG, for liquefied natural gas. And most of the liquefied natural gas that is traded, especially in East and Southeast Asia, is based on oil. So oil is important for at least those two reasons. Now, what happens in the oil market is that if there is one word that explains current state of the oil market is we are facing an oil glut, a lot of oil. First, on the supply side, we have OPEC Plus, which kind of reversed all the cuts, the production cuts that they had introduced since 2 years ago. So that's one reason, too much oil from OPEC Plus. United States apparently has turned out to be very resilient in terms of oil production, much more than most analysts, the economists thought. So shale oil is coming out at a high rate in the US. We also have signs in the United States that there will be less regulation, environmental regulations in the oil market, so that's going to be, it's another kind of boost in oil production in the United States. And we also have weak demand in the global oil market, and that the key source of the weak demand comes from China. China emerged as a strong consumer of oil in 2023 when they emerged out of the COVID because they opened a bit later than other countries. But since then, demand of oil from China has come down close to zero, I would say, no change in demand. And that reflects two factors, or rather one factor. First, there's a huge push in China, which we all probably know, for electrification of the passenger fleet. Most passenger cars in China that are sold today are electric vehicles. And the second and the less known fact is that most of the trucking industry in China uses now natural gas instead of diesel. By some estimates, about 3/4 of the trucks that has been sold in China this year are natural gas powered, not diesel. So for those two reasons, demand growth rather in China is close to zero. So in other words, there's plenty of oil, and we expect low oil prices this year, next year, and the year after, in 2027. The other side of the energy markets, we have natural gas. This is an interesting market for reasons that you probably all know. What happened in Europe 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, rather, with a natural gas price spike. But since then, a lot of measures have been taken both in Europe and the other side of the Atlantic, where you have a lot of LNG trade taking place, a lot of LNG plants being built and projected to be built in the United States. It appears that Europe will be completely independent from Russian LNG, from Russian energy down the road, and it will be mostly dependent on the United States and in the countries' LNG sources from the Middle East. Now, what happens in natural gas market, in my opinion, is the only commodity market, across all commodity markets, that has undergone a structural transformation that is here to stay, meaning that pipeline supplies to Europe from Russia are pretty much gone, and you will have an extensive, rather an increasing trade in LNG from the United States to Europe, but also from the United States and Middle East to other countries in Asia. So that sector has undergone a complete transformation, and we do expect that prices of natural gas that have come down compared to what they were back in 2022, but they're going to stay elevated for the long term, and that's what I mean by structural transformation in that market. Now, on fertilizers, prices came down quite a bit after the spike of 2022-23. But fertilizer prices have spiked recently, and in fact, for this year, we expect fertilizer prices to increase by 20% in the year as a whole, 2025 compared to 2024. And that's very interesting and important because we expect energy prices to decline 12%. And in most years, fertilizer price and energy prices move in tandem, but not this year. However, I do think that we have a good understanding of what transpired in the fertilizer markets and what caused the spike. First, we have trade restrictions from China, which exports quite a bit of nitrogen-based fertilizer as well as phosphate. From the data that we have from China, it looks like this year, year to date that is, they have exported only 10% compared to what they exported back in 2022 and 2020, and the years basically prior to 2023. So we basically do not have much exports coming out of China. We also have increased input costs apart from natural gas prices, which are, as I said, stable. We have other input costs for fertilizer markets which have spiked. And we also have the European Union change in the tariff structure against Belarus and Russia, which I believe is going to be phased in for this year and the next 2 years or 3 years. So, and strong demand from the agricultural sector. So for those 4 reasons, we have seen this spike in fertilizer prices. To summarize, on energy, the news is good from the supply side, that is, not from the environmental side. And on fertilizer prices, we have the spike this year, but I don't think the news is very bad there as well. We expect stability. And that's pretty much the summary of the input on the input side on agriculture. Now, I would like to make a couple of remarks on climate change. And again, subject to the fact that I'm not an environmental economist. And what I wanted to say here is the following. I have the feeling sometimes that we struggle to convince others for the urgency, so to speak, of the problem of climate change, or rather not climate change, the effects of climate change on agriculture. And let me give you a couple of numbers on this, based on what we heard this morning on the presentation from the OECD and our own numbers. When we look at the supply of crops this year, based on FAO and USDA data, we pretty much see that supply of all crops, meaning grains as well as edible oils, is the same, the growth in supply rather, it's the same as it has been for the past 30 to 35 years on average. So in other words, this year, crop production globally is going to grow at the same rate as it has grown, grew on average for the past 35 years. So we are on average on that. Based on some of my own research and research I've done with colleagues, when we looked at yields, that is land productivity, what we found is that for the past 55 to 60 years, there has not been a trend either upward or downward in yields. Just to give you a number, for the past 55 years, the world has been adding the equivalent of 32 kilograms of wheat in each hectare of land, globally speaking. And I'm talking about taking into account all food commodities from FAO data. So that's the second number I wanted to give you. And the third, rather, not a number, an argument, is that what Tassos said in the morning about the long-term decline, or rather reversal, he put it in the question format, or the stability of agricultural prices that the OECD used, that kind of flat line, which the way I see it, that after so many years, we either see declining price or perhaps flat prices. And the question I have now is the following: how are we going to convince the public, the audience, or even policymakers that there's an effect of climate change on agriculture if yields have not been affected? Current trends in production have been pretty much in line with historical trends, and prices perhaps have not increased. I think we have a hard time here to convince others, or at least, And again, let me qualify that I'm not a skeptic on climate change. By no means, I'm not a skeptic. But I'm just from a research perspective, I think we have a hard time to convince others, especially policymakers, that there's an issue here. Now, before I conclude, I will also like to make another observation. If we look at three crops, coffee, cocoa, rather two types of coffee and cocoa, we have seen that those prices have exploded, so to speak, the past 3 to 4 years. For example, cocoa in real terms this year is 230% in real terms compared to what it was 7 years ago. Coffee is 240% higher than compared to 7 years ago. That's in real terms. There are some other commodities, again, three crops, the price of which have spiked recently meaning the past 3 to 4 years. You may all remember what happened to olive oil prices 2 to 3 years ago. They have come down, but not to the levels that were prior to 2022. There were issues in oranges. We had a spike there a couple of years ago. And as we speak, we have issue with coconut oil and palm kernel oil, the same issue that we face in other commodities. So, to conclude, what I'm saying is that, or what I'm observing is that we may see the effect of climate change on agriculture. We do not see it in crops simply because farmers adapt there. We may be seeing that in tree crops. So a question that I'm asking to the researchers here is perhaps we should pay more attention to tree crops and see what's the effect of climate change there, because in my opinion, those are the leading indicators, if I can borrow a term from macroeconomics. And with that, I will end my intervention.
I appreciate your provocative comments around reframing some of the narrative around thinking about climate and agriculture. Alan, nice to see you. I'll pass the floor directly to you, and then maybe we can circle back and see if people on the panel would like to have a conversation with the others on the panel, if there's things that have come up that you'd like to comment on. So over to you, Alan.
Well, first of all, sorry for giving you a mini heart attack, Leanne, and good afternoon to everybody. I wasn't, unfortunately, able to take part in the earlier part, so I've obviously coming a little bit late. But I'd love to ask John a question on his yields. I'll keep that perhaps for the next round. Our question, I think, is what can go wrong? But let me perhaps just first give you what I took as the summary headlines from the OECD FAO outlook. We do see global consumption slowing down. We see also production slowing down, but still moving sufficiently ahead that real prices, if you look at the line, it does seem to be trending downwards. So, a return, I would guess, to the old treadmill model of the textbooks, where technical progress is kind of pushing prices down. The drawback, of course, is that we don't have enough of that technical progress, because in both crops, although productivity growth is by far the biggest contributor to overall production growth, it's still not sufficient. So we do see in the outlook an expansion of cropland, we see an expansion of herd numbers, and we see an increase in greenhouse gas emissions from the primary agricultural sector. So against that background, I wanted just to pick up on the trend in the prices. First of all, it seems to me that it can be important to make a distinction between whether prices increase largely because of adverse supply shocks, or because, if you like, of positive demand shocks. So John has structured his remarks around energy and climate. So if I think of an adverse, you were very optimistic on the energy prices over the near term, but if we think of an adverse energy shock, that is clearly going to push producer prices up. I should say, by the way, that higher prices for food products for consumers are clearly bad all round for consumers. What I'm trying to make the point is that the nature of higher prices for producers can differ depending on the nature of the shock. So if you have an increase in farm prices, which is largely driven by an increase in input costs, then clearly that puts additional pressure on producers. We would see a squeeze of farm income. But if you have higher producer prices, so primary agricultural prices at a global level, because of the impact of climate change, if indeed we put John's remarks for one moment just to one side and we assume that there is going to be some negative impacts over the coming years, then of course if you're in an area that has not necessarily suffered at least the same degree of shock, you will benefit from those higher prices as a producer. You will actually be better off because your input costs haven't increased. You haven't suffered that yield hit that perhaps is mainly occurring in the tropics. So the nature of those those shocks seems to be important in terms of trying to understand the impact, at least for producers. The main what could go wrong point that I would like to highlight actually comes from the sister report that OECD and OECD in this case alone produces on the agricultural policy monitoring, because clearly the types of disruption to the trade regime that Joe has been outlining is leading many countries to reconsider the extent of their interdependence, if you like, on world markets. So we see the rhetoric around food security, food sovereignty, and of course food self-sufficiency increasing in crescendoing, if you like. I think around the world, we certainly see it in the European Union. If you look at our near neighbour in Norway, for example, big increases in agricultural support. So I think we are in an era where we're going to see increasing government support for farming around the world as countries try to increase their levels of self-sufficiency. We saw what happened in the 1980s with that. It was the fall in world market prices was what drove the two big agricultural powers at the time, the US and the EU, to arrive at the Uruguay Round agreement. And it's not clear to me that we have the institutional structures in place that will help us to address, if you like, that reversal in terms of the downward trend in agricultural support. So that would be one of the things that I would sort of want to highlight as a potential negative impact. The other one, and again, it's picking up on some of Joe's remarks, is the disruption to the trade regime itself. And we have focused, or Joe has focused his remarks very much on the tariff turmoil. We all recall the introduction of the so-called reciprocal tariffs by the US president in April of last year. But let's just remember that wasn't the first use of the term reciprocity in trade policy. Does that ring any bells to those of us who are here from the European Union? Were we not the first to say we wanted to have reciprocity in trade policy? We didn't like it when somebody else imposed reciprocal tariffs on us. Yet, there's a very strong conversation in the European Union that this is exactly what we want to do on our trading partners. And it's a difficult issue. I did a paper for the ELO some years ago on this topic, and it was still hedging my bets. I probably still am hedging my bets a little bit. Because if you have imposed high standards, high environmental standards on your own producers, and let's be clear that we're not talking about the SPS standards here, which remain entirely, provided they're science-based, but they remain entirely within the legitimate actions of WTO members to impose restrictions on that basis. So we're talking here about the environmental standards, let's say, that European farmers have to meet, more limited availability of pesticides, stronger restrictions on the use of antibiotics in animal production and so on, that kind of thing. Clearly, these raise costs, can raise costs for our own producers. That can lead to production shifting overseas, increased imports from countries that don't have the same level of environmental standards. So we can see, if you like, a demand, not only by the producers, but interestingly enough, a sort of a coalition of both the environmental NGOs and the producers on this issue, saying, look, we've got to impose the same standards as we require of our own producers on imports from third countries. And of course, we see the pushback from third countries in terms of the sustainability standards for vegetable oils, for example. The deforestation regulation, we don't know quite what's going to happen there, but it was clear that there also was quite a pushback there in terms of the implications for exporting countries. So, the dilemma here is if we continue along this road, and as I say, there are strong political economy reasons, it's very hard to make a case why producers should have to face competition that they would see as unfair, but it does lead to huge fragmentation of potentially of the trade system. So. In the longer term, if we go down this route, it does raise big questions about how long we can, if you like, retain a sort of a common understanding of the benefits of trade, which are huge when it comes, for example, to addressing some of the impacts of extreme climate events. So those would be my initial comments. I hope I haven't said things that you've heard already earlier in the day, but let me stop there, Leanne.
Okay, well, so that's a lot of things to throw on the table. I have three. So, Joe, you said you had some additional climate remarks. I don't know if after listening to this, we could go there. Alan said he has some questions on yields that he wants to address to John. I have some questions on institutional structures, just maybe to have Alan talk a little bit more about your thinking of that and hear what people, because your comment was you weren't sure that we have the institutional structures in place to kind of pull us out of the direction that we're headed, I think, in terms of the trading system and the way countries are positioning themselves within what we used to think we took for granted as the multilateral trading system. So I'll pass it over to you, Joe, first, okay. And then let's see. Okay.
And let me change it. Yeah, let me change it just a bit. One thing I did want to talk about insofar as the baseline is concerned, and I think this came out in the discussion this morning on cereals and other things, is this implicit assumption, based on policy. So, unfortunately, since almost all biofuel production is very much policy-based, whatever's in place, that's why a lot of these growth in biofuels is pretty flat. Yet we know that that does change. I mean, I look at the U.S. where we're seeing biodiesel production, soybean oil use for biodiesel is something like 52% right now, of 53% of domestic consumption of soybean oil is for biodiesel. I mean, it's an amazing statistic compared, and even compared to 3 years ago where it was only 45%. So that's still actually increasing, and I think the baseline probably incorporates that because they have seen some of those announcements. But you have things like sustainable aviation fuel where people are talking about it. If a move like that, or a move from 10% blends in ethanol to 15%, mandates for 15% blends, those things could change very, very quickly, like what we saw in 2007 through 2012. And I still fear a lot of those discussions we had at that time about off-ramps for mandates and that sort of thing. We just haven't thought through those things. And that's a concern I have, even though, again, the comment someone made this morning is, oh, these things are going great. You know, we use the byproducts for feed. This brings a lot of economic activity. And I don't dispute any of that. But there still is this basic component with biofuel production that it's not doesn't respond to price. What it responds to are mandates and subsidies. And if we have those in times when we do have tight supplies, that because those demands are highly inelastic or not responsive to price, that means that that sends prices higher because, again, of the obvious things there. Sorry, so that had little to do with climate, although if we get into climate again, I'll bring in some stuff. But
Okay, so maybe would you like to articulate your question, Alan, which was around the yields statements that
Yeah, I
John
mean,
said?
John's remarks were really interesting. But just on the trend growth in yields, I would separate that into the trend growth, if you like, in the frontier yields, the yield potential, and then, if you like, the growth in catching up. And the extent to which we observe, on average, a sort of steady growth in yields, is that because of the impact of the catching up? Because certainly some of the evidence from the European experience would suggest that we are reaching a sort of plateau of yields in some of the cereal crops, wheat in particular, I think. So I'm just wondering, would you see that separation as a useful point to
No,
yeah.
I agree very much with you that the separation is very important, and the comment I made, the remark I made about yields is based on a study that we did with my colleagues just recently, about less than 2 years ago, where we looked at globally, we took all commodities that are recorded by the Food and Agriculture Organization, the production of all food commodities, so we converted them to calorific content. There are, of course, reasons as to why one would argue this is not the best way to aggregate, but that was, I believe, the only way that we could do it. And we also looked at globally how much land is allocated to those crops, and we calculated the yield. And that's what I mean by the result that I gave, that on average every year the world has been adding the equivalent of, based on calorific content, 32 kilograms of wheat per year. Now, that's a global sort of average. When you look below the global and you go regional, you go by commodities, you find all sorts of differences there. And differences that are, some of them are well understood. You see, for example, complete stagnation in Africa. You see the acceleration in the advanced economies in the earlier years, like 1960s and 1970s. You see acceleration of yield growth in East Asia because of the Green Revolution, etc. So you pretty much see the things that we know about yield growth. Nothing surprising there. Let me back up for a minute. The reason we did that study because there was this question as to whether there has been a deceleration in the growth of yields. Yields grow. I mean, there's no dispute about this. The question was whether there has been a deceleration. And in a lot of the literature, where researchers looked at the individual commodities, individual countries, they did find quite a bit of deceleration. And where we came in and we think that we had a kind of value added in our study is that, yes, we understand this. individual for individual country or individual commodity, but when you aggregate all commodities and all countries, you find this flat. So perhaps not an earth-shaking finding, but I think it's important to also take it into account. And yeah.
So we sort of have, in terms of things that can go wrong, we have John's comments on inputs, risks, some on climate, although nuanced around that. We have comments around trade policy and trade wars and destabilization. We have comments around, do we have the institutions that can get us out of this? So maybe we can come back to this institutional question, which I find quite interesting, which links back to how we started the day, I think, around trust, right? So when I think about what's going on and whether or not the world comes back from a trade war, for me, part of that question is this trust component and our building trading relationships, again, that are practical and workable, and I don't know if collaborative is the right word for trade relationships, but that work for both parties, that kind of thing. What kind of institutional ideas should we be thinking about, Alan?
Trust was a word that came to my mind. Before I answer your question, Leanne, there was one remark I wanted to that I recalled in terms of Joe's comments on trade policy. In the Financial Times, I think it was yesterday, the day before, and they were commenting on the nature of the US-China trade deal. And when I would have been learning my development economics, we used to talk a lot about the North-South trade patterns, where the South was a sort of a producer of raw materials and imported manufactured goods and technology from the supposedly more developed countries in the North. And the comment was that apparently the deal that the US has made with China is that China is going to buy more soybeans and it's going to buy more timber, and in return the US will get access to high-tech, well, at least you could say rare earths are maybe also a commodity or a natural resource. But anyway, I thought that was just a sort of an interesting comment on the nature of the bargaining that's going on at the moment. Yeah, I mean, I suppose one thing is that although we have seen a huge amount of disruption as a result of particularly the United States sort of exercising this sort of power politics view of trade, but a lot of trade is still continuing under agreements. Obviously, the European Union has a lot of bilateral free trade agreements. In Asia, we see I never remember the acronym CTT, anyway, which apparently has a huge waiting list of countries that actually have applied to join. So I suppose it's a question of keeping our worries about what has happened over the last 12 months, in some kind of perspective. That the world trading system, and Joe mentioned how well it has reacted to date. It hasn't collapsed. So far, and I think there are those elements where we do see countries, trying to work out together what modus vivendi they can come to sort of govern their trade relations, but. I mean, we all believed that when we entered into these political commitments, because at the end of the day, okay, they're legal treaties, but we can withdraw from them, as we've seen. So they were essentially political commitments, and we were taking those as face value. And what we have learned over the last 12 months is that actually that was perhaps a naive thing to do, and maybe even a dangerous thing to do, in the sense that we developed our economic strategies on the basis of that belief, and that belief has now certainly taken knocking, and it will be, much more difficult to put it together again. But I suppose I'm just trying to be a little bit optimistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me follow up on that, because I do think about that a lot. And you think about the 20s and the 30s and how things did spiral out of control with tariffs, where other countries started putting on tariffs as well. I mean, it wasn't just Smoot-Hawley, it was a global environment of that. And what worries me, I think, is the sort of trade diversion that one could see from some of these tariffs, that all of a sudden China having to find other markets and putting a lot of exports into other markets where their only reaction can be, we're putting up barriers as well. I mean, you see it in metals to a degree, or steel and aluminum, at least with these things that other countries are now. So that to me is still, let's hope it doesn't. I mean, in an ideal world, this would all go back to normal, in a few years, and that everyone would say, okay, now that was an episode we can forget about. Just let's hope it doesn't prolong because of further deteriorations.
Yeah, please.
Just, I'm going to change the subject a bit,
Okay.
go back to energy because of
Your guy.
Yes.
Alan made a remark, and thank you, Alan, for making that remark about what, in response to the question, what could go wrong. You said something along the lines that you can have another shock in the energy markets or something, which I appreciate the fact that you did that, and I intentionally did not say anything about another shock in energy markets in my remarks. And the reason is that a lot of things went wrong, so to speak, in the Middle East for the last 2 years or 3 years, and we did not really see any effect on either the flows of energy, specifically oil, nor did we see much of an effect on the oil price. We did see a couple of oil spikes taking place after the events, but then markets pretty much returned to normal, I would say, whatever the term normal means. Now, the reason I'm intervening against on this is the following, that when we say energy shock or oil shock, for most economists, for most of us, our mind goes back to the shocks of 1972 and 1979. So at least that's what most economists think. And what I wanted to say is that today's energy markets and oil markets are completely different, if I use that term, compared to what they were prior to the 1980s. For example, today the world has much less reliance on oil. We have much more diverse sources of energy. We use other types of energy in addition to oil, much more than what we used to do back then. We have more sources on oil today. When we had the oil price shock, high oil prices induced production in Alaska, Gulf of Mexico, and in the North Sea. When we had the oil spike of 2010 through 2013, we had new sources of oil. Canadian oil sands and oil shale from the United States, and one could put also biofuels in that category. That was probably a response. So we have more sources of oil. In the oil markets, we have well-developed futures markets. Contracts that go 10 to 11 years ahead. That's unique to the oil markets. And that's important to compare with prior to 1980, we do not have oil futures markets. And that's also another contrast here in agricultural commodities. For example, we had futures markets since 1880 or 1890. We do not have that in oil markets. Oil futures is a very, very recent event. Then we have the International Energy Agencies, which coordinates policies across countries if something goes wrong. So for those reasons and many others which we have outlined in a report that we did last year in the World Bank, what I wanted to say is the oil market today is completely different than compared to what it was prior to the 1980s, and that's why I don't think we're going to see shocks in the oil market. I mean, we could, I'm not saying, but at least that's what this is the main reason why I chose not to have an oil price shock or an energy price shock as an answer to the question, what could go wrong?
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm doing my moderator role and noticing the time. I don't know if there are any, this has been such a great conversation on the stage. I don't know if there are any questions or comments from the floor. I'm kind of giving Tassos significant looks. Yes? And then I'll just say a couple of words to wrap us up, and then we'll call it a day. Thank you.
Each other very well, so I can really. There is one thing that you left completely out, and I will be provocative. The way Trump left it out after the election results, which is the impact on this on the consumer side, both on energy and on food. If we act as, analysts, where we only look at what we have put there, there is no real impact on what we're having. We've seen that before. But at the level of prices, whether it is food, whether it's energy, there is a real impact that allows populists to have a party right now. And this is not really coming out from the type, because of the constraints we have when we produce Outlook, from the type of numbers that we put out. And that's where, in my view, things could go pretty much wrong. And you haven't touched it, so it's just an observation. And I know why it's difficult to touch. The second thing has to do with something that John have looked at, and I've seen in the paper before, on the potential of climate impact. If you break what you aggregated as grains and oilseeds, I think it was, John, there is a distinct difference between the food and the feed component in terms of how yields are doing. Because yields on food are flat, even on those that are not on the frontier, except maybe China and India. But yields on feed relevant are moving up. There is technology as a background, but there is also a potential both on the supply and the demand side and the trade implications.
I'm looking at if there's anybody else. No. So let's kind of conclude. So you feel free to react to Tassos's comments, and then if you have any last comments that you'd like to make, and we'll go down the panel.
Yeah, no, so let me address the consumer issue, because I think that is really important. I think one of the things, the questions I get and others probably get as well is, hey, weren't you guys saying that this is going to cause a lot of inflation, and yet inflation's been coming down, food prices are still high relative to historical averages, but 3% rather than the 2%. How come it's not higher? And a lot of it is that so many of the products that we import in terms of food products are exempt, right? So anything coming from Mexico, as long as it's, or Canada, as long as it's compliant with USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico Canada Free Trade Agreement, it's exempt. So fruits and vegetables, if those had been hit with 20, 30% tariffs, we would see very big impacts in the U.S. But even with that, you are seeing very significant things. Coffee, for example. I think, at least the near term, we haven't quite seen the suppliers react, but the diversion on that, Brazil has been essentially shut out of the market. I was talking to someone from Nicaragua who ships coffee, and they're facing right now a proposed 100% tariff on U.S. goods. So those things are coming home. I have told this story to a couple of people. I was surprised that I just ordered something from Denmark, and it arrived in my a rain poncho for biking, arrived at my house, and with that came a FedEx bill for $40. And I thought, oh, this is just a fluke. Somebody's trying to scam me. And then I thought, oh, no, it's a supplemental tariff. So it hits home even to those of us who write about it. So very definitely. And I think if that were to persist and become evident, and remember, these supplemental tariffs, for the most part, are just now hitting. Right? People are just now seeing the effects of those things and saying, why am I paying more for it? So, I don't think it's over, let alone the fact that, what's going on in the courts may cause big changes over the next week or two. So
Those are your final remarks.
those were my final comments.
Okay.
I'm sticking to them.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, on Tassos' point, Tasso, I fully agree with you that when you look at the aggregate yield number, you get you get a main result, and when you disaggregate it, that I was saying earlier to Alan's comment, you get different results, whether it's by country, by commodity, or as you said, by feed versus food. I fully agree with you, but what I wanted to highlight here is two issues. First, it's always good to have the big number on top, and then start disaggregating it, just to make the debate more balanced and more reasonable, so we know what we're talking about. That's one thing. And the second issue, it again goes back to the climate change, is that it's also important to ask the question, to challenge ourselves. Again, not that I'm a climate denier, but to challenge myself. If there's an effect of climate change on food commodities, why have not seen a deceleration in yields? I just want to ask that question as a scientist or economist, at least.
Thank you very much. Alan, do you have a final reflection?
Well, just, I mean, I think Tassos raises a very important point about consumer food prices. I took it that you, in a sense, were observing this increase in food prices even before April of this year. That, in a sense, so the trade issue is relevant here, but there's clearly, if I speak just for the European Union, which are the figures that I know best, I mean, we've seen a dramatic increase in food prices since, well, from 2022 onwards. So, and it's a paradox to explain that, because on the one hand, we know that the share of primary producers in the consumer euro or consumer dollar, as you would have in the US, in northwestern Europe, it's as low as 10% now. It's 20% in the somewhat poorer countries in Central and Eastern Europe, but it's 10 to 20%. So it's you know, where has that increase come from? Of course, there was a lot of talk about greed inflation, profit gouging. In fact, that was also part of the American presidential election campaign. But the evidence doesn't really support that. There doesn't seem to be, it's difficult, of course, to get evidence on margins in the distribution chain, easier in the States. I mean, there were spikes, but it's unfair to take, say, a specific year, because there are huge lags in the price transmission through the food distribution chain. So you can certainly get significant differences for a single year, but if you actually look at it over a period, no real evidence that profit margins have dramatically increased. So, you know, I think one of the answers is that food is a particularly energy-intensive commodity all along the food chain, so not just in terms of production, but also at retail level. When you look at the freezer compartments and so on in our supermarkets, you look at all the trucks that need to bring the food around, the processing of food, and so on. So, I mean, I think you know, there has been an energy element, it seems to me, to that. And if John's optimism, and I think his arguments are very strong, suggest that, you know, we may have a period of relative calm in energy markets. Certainly food prices are not going to come down, but let's hope that we don't. And even if you look at the moment, the last 6 months, food prices have been actually quite, despite coffee and beef and so on in the European Union, but we're still bumping along at about the 2% annual rate of inflation in food at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, so this has been a great panel. So first of all, join me in thanking the panel for this discussion, which, you know, covered a huge range of ground. I'm not going to try to summarize the whole day, because obviously for those of you who've been here the whole day, you know we've covered many, many topics. I'll be back tomorrow after reflecting to try to summarize a little bit more what went on. But there were kind of 3 buckets of topics that I think really stood out to me. Of course, the first one is this importance of analysis, modeling, data and evidence, making sure that investments are sustained in those areas because we have to have something to base decisions on. Decision makers at all levels need to have that, and that it's tricky. And it's not always obvious where those need to go when the world is changing, like how they need to evolve when the world is changing so quickly. The second category of themes that came up really had to do with all the policies, both existing policies, uncertainty about future policies, the importance of policies when we're thinking about navigating the triple challenge in agriculture. So we're trying to balance environment, food security, and farmer livelihoods. That's a complex challenge for policymakers, obviously. We heard many comments around that. And then the last one I wanted to mention is just this importance, and it came up in different ways, of ongoing engagement in a cooperative way. So it came up around breaking silos across working within governments, making sure that policies are coherent. It came up with cooperating around data. How do we make sure that the data methodologies, for example, speak to each other and provide good synthetic information for decision makers? And it came up around trade. So making sure that we're still thinking about those kinds of relationships, cross-country relationships, and being optimistic about how those can evolve in the future, even given some of the what could go wrong conversations that we've had so far. So with that, I'll wrap up the day, and I thank you all for being with us all day. I'm looking over to see if there are any remarks to transition us till tomorrow. No, we're good. So tomorrow, this is not tomorrow, this is next year. So save the date for the annual conference, which is April 14th, 2026, I suppose in Brussels. And there'll be more information to follow. Okay, so I've done my job. Thank you everyone.